What's up? This is Josh, our Break Your Stereo, and we're going to go through a full build on this 2018 Chevy Silverado. We're doing suspension and wheels and tires, so we're going to take you through the whole process to checking off the parts on the parts list, the full installation, and then of course the full reveal. Okay, so first we're going to go over the parts list. It's always important to make sure you have all your parts before you start, because obviously if you're going through it and you're missing a part or two and your car's up on the lift or in the middle of your driveway and you get stuck because you don't have a part, it could be a disaster. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're just gonna go through the kit content here. We have the pictures here, so I'm just gonna mark these things off as we go along. So we have the rear blocks. So I'm just gonna mark these here that we have them. We have the front knuckles. We have the cross members, front and rear. We have the skid plate. This one is a four-wheel drive. And then also, because it is four-wheel drive, we have the differential drop brackets, which are here. The fin, and then the bracket for the fin. CV axle spacers here. Sway bar drop brackets. Tie rods. Sway bar end links. U-bolts. And then brake line extension. In this case we have three. One, two, and this is the rear brake line extension, if I'm not mistaken. It's not depicted here, but we have it, which is good. And then because this is the upgraded system, we don't have the strut spacers. We have the full struts, and then obviously we don't have the basic rear shocks. We have the rear shocks with the reservoirs. So, and then we have all our hardware, all our packs. Okay, I'll be reading off Rough Country's instruction manual, and if you're following along with the included instructions, then you have a real comprehensive guide as to how this kit is put on. We're going to skip ahead to step 3 because the first 2 steps have to do with getting the truck in the air safely. Okay, so make sure you're paying close attention to what the manual says. Step 3, remove the wheels and tires. Remove the 6 bolts holding the factory skid plate using a 15mm socket. Unplug the 2 connectors going to the electric power steering wire harness behind the front skid plate. Step 4. Remove and unplug the ABS wire from the frame. Step 5. Remove the sensor wire from the plastic clip. Remove the brake line bracket and the control arm using a 10mm wrench. Next, remove the brake line bracket from the control arm pocket using a 13mm wrench. Step 6. Using a 21mm wrench, remove the tie rod as shown. Strike the front mount to dislodge the tie rod. Step 7. Remove the brake caliper using the 18mm socket. Hang the caliper out of the way and remove the rotor using a 30 torque socket. Step 8. Use a 10mm socket and remove the ABS bracket from the top side of the knuckle. Step 9. Remove the dust cap and then remove the axle nut using a 35mm socket. Step 10. Remove the upper ball joint using an 18mm socket and separate using the hammer and striking the knuckle on the side as shown. Step 11. Remove the lower ball joint using a 24mm socket and separate with the hammer as shown. Next, remove the knuckle from the truck. Step 12. Using a 15mm wrench and socket, remove the sway bar links from the truck. Step 13. Remove the lower strut bolt using a 15mm socket as shown, and remove the upper strut nuts using an 18mm wrench. Remove the strut from the truck. Step 14. Remove the CV axle bolts using a 15mm socket. Step 15. Using a 10mm socket, remove the sway bar from the bottom of the frame. Step 16. Remove the lower control arms using a 18mm wrench and a 24mm socket. Step 17. Use an 18mm wrench and socket. Remove the factory lower cross members. Step 18. Using an 11mm socket, remove the drive shaft from the front diff. Unplug the actuator wire from the diff. Remove wire loom from the diff. And remove the vent tube from the diff. Step 19. Make sure the steering wheel is straight. Mark the steering shaft and pinion as shown. With the jack, support the rack and pinion using a 24mm and an 18mm socket. Remove the bolts from the front of the rack and pinion mounts. Carefully remove the rack and pinion, making sure no wires are in harm's way. Now you can remove the diff using an 18mm and 21mm socket. Remove the bolts from the diff and remove diff from the truck. Mark the front and rear sides of the driver and passenger side control arm pockets. Measure 3 3/8 from the end and cut off the factory crossmember mount. Step 21. On the driver and passenger rear side control arm pocket, cut off the lip flush, 1 inch past the control arm hole. Sand edges and paint to prevent rust. Step 22. On the passenger side of the diff, cut the front ear off using a sawzall or cutoff wheel. Step 23. Reinstall the rack and pinion with the factory hardware using a 24mm and 18mm socket. Make sure to align the marks on the steering shaft. Install the passenger side diff drop bracket with the supplied 12mm flange locks and the factory studs. Tighten with an 18mm wrench. Torque all hardware to factory specs. Step 24. Install the driver's side diff bracket with the factory bolts and torque down to factory specs with an 18mm socket. Step 25. Install the diff using the supplied 12mm bolts and flange nuts on the driver's side. And 12mm bolt and stock nut on the passenger side. Do not tighten at this time. So the cross member did hit a little bit, so we did have to cut in order for it to slide in. Step 26. Install the front cross member using the new 5/8 by 4.5 bolts, washers, and nuts. Hand tighten. Step 27. Install center diff drop mounting bracket using the supplied 1/2 inch by 1 inch bolts and nuts to the front cross member. Tighten with the 3/8 socket and wrench. Torque to 90 pounds. Step 28. Remove the 3 bolts on the diff as shown. Next, install the center diff drop bracket with the 3 bolts removed earlier and attach the bracket to the front diff mount. With the supplied 14mm by 85mm bolt, washers, and lock nut. Torque hardware to factory specs. After installing the diff, torque all diff bolts. Make sure the diff on the passenger side clears the rack and pinion and no wires are pinched between the diff and the rack. Torque down to factory specs. Plug in the vent tube extension and the 4x4 actuator. Step 30. Install the drive shaft using the stock hardware and an 11mm wrench to tighten. Torque to factory specs. Step 31. Install the rear cross member with the supplied 5/8 by 5.5 bolts. Hand tighten. Step 32. Install the lower control arm with the stock hardware. Hand tighten. At this point, plug back in all the harnesses for the steering, the diff, and the rack and pinion. Make sure to reroute the wires how they were when you remove them. Now tighten the 5/8 bolts that secure the cross members to the frame with a 25mm bolt. Now tighten the 5/8 bolts that secure the cross members to the frame with a 24mm wrench. Torque to 175 pounds. Install the sway bar bracket using 10mm by 35mm bolts and washers. Tighten using a 17mm wrench. Install sway bar using stock bolts with new 10mm nuts. Use a 10mm socket and a 17mm wrench to tighten. Now in the instructions, it says to install the stock sway bar links, but we're going to wait on that. Step 34. Install the CV spacer between the axle shaft and the differential. Use the supplied bolts to attach it. Now in order to torque these down, we had to use a pry bar to keep the axles from spinning. Just make sure you're not jamming the pry bar into or against any of the differential. The diff is aluminum and could possibly crack. Torque down to 35 pounds. Step 35. Install the supplied sway bar link using the supplied nuts. Do not impact. Torque to 90 pounds using a 19mm and a 21mm socket. Again, do not impact. 36. On the factory knuckles, remove the bearing assembly using a 15mm wrench. Next, the brake shroud must be trimmed to allow the caliper to be installed on the new knuckle. Mark the disc shroud as shown. Install the factory bearing and disc shroud into the new supplied knuckle. Tighten with a 15mm wrench. Torque to factory specs. Step 37. Install brake line drop brackets to the frame using stock hardware. Next, secure the factory brake line mount and the new drop bracket using the supplied 5/16 by 1 inch bolts, washers, and nuts. Use a 13mm wrench and a socket to tighten. Torque to 35 pounds. Now you do have to tug on these brake lines in order for them to stretch down, but be careful. Carefully install the coilover, pulling the reservoir first through the control arms. Install the reservoir mount on the top of the strut mount using the supplied hardware. Bolt the lower strut to the lower control arm using the supplied hardware. Now tighten down the upper strut hardware and the lower strut hardware. Step 42. Remove the ABS wire from the brake line clip and remove the brake line and trim as shown. Reinstall the modified bracket with the stock hardware and reinstall the ABS wire in the clip. Step 43. Install the knuckles using stock hardware. Use a 24mm bolt for the lower ball joint and an 18mm bolt for the upper ball joint. Use a 35mm socket for the axle nut. Install the rotor and install the bolt using a 30mm torque socket. Install the brake caliper using an 18mm socket for the bolts. Torque down to factory specs. Step 44. Install the supplied tie rod ends and the tie rod to the attached knuckle using the supplied hardware. Install skid plate using the 3/8 by 1.25 inch bolts and washers. Use a 14mm socket to tighten all bolts. Torque to 35 pounds. Okay, onto the rear. Read steps 1 and 2 for safety, and we're going to begin with step 3. Install the brake line bracket to the new bracket using the supplied 5/16 by 1 inch bolt, nuts, and washers. Reinstall the assembly in the stock location with the stock hardware using a 13mm wrench. Torque to 20 pounds. Step 4. Remove the e-brake wire from the frame with a 13mm socket. Use the supplied drop bracket and the factory bolt to mount to the frame. Use the supplied 5/16 by 1 inch bolt, washer, and nut to mount the factory wire bracket to the new drop bracket. Torque to 20 pounds. Step 5. Remove the ABS wire, if equipped, from the frame rail as shown to allow slack in the line. Step 7. Lightly support the differential with the jack. Step 8. Remove the stock shock absorbers using a 21mm wrench. Retain the hardware for reuse. Step 9. Remove the stock U-bolts and lower the axle to allow the supplied block to be installed. Note, the short side of the block goes towards the front of the vehicle. Step 10. Install the new block with the supplied 7/16 by 3 inch U-bolts. So those U-bolts go on top of the leaf spring like that and just hand tighten at this time. Now tighten down. And torque to 45 pounds. Step 11. Install the supplied U-bolts and tighten using a 22mm wrench and a cross pattern. Do not torque down yet. We'll do that when the truck is on the floor. Step 12. Install the shock absorbers in the factory locations. Step 13. Using WD-40, lubricate the ABS wire and slide the rubber sleeve down to allow the wire to be reinstalled in the clip on the frame. The connector will be reattached to the top of the frame. Reroute the lines as needed to gain significant slack. Now lower the vehicle on the floor and we'll now torque down a few bolts. It doesn't say this in the manual, but we found by doing this, it eliminates any binding you might get while torquing down while in the air. But first we'll mount the reservoirs down for the coilovers. Starting with the lower A-arms, torque down to 110 pounds. Now with the 10mm, torque the sway bar brackets to 35 pounds. And now torque the sway bar end links to 90 pounds. Now the lower strut mounts to factory specs and the upper strut mounts to factory specs. Now go ahead and mount the ABS wire bracket to the A-arm. Slide the clip over by spraying WD-40 to make it easier. Tighten with a 10mm wrench. Now torque the U-bolts in the rear in a cross pattern to 90 pounds. And torque the shocks down to factory specs.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So we're finally done with this thing. And these are the wheels and tires we put on this. So if you want to come close real quick, we got the black Rhino. These are the Oceanos. And these are obviously in gloss black. They are 20 by 9.5, negative 18 offset. And you can kind of see here how far it comes off the fender. So a little more in the front than the rear, of course, because anytime you do a knuckle kit, that knuckle kit will push this forward. If you look in the back, it doesn't come out quite as much. So if you don't like that, you can always get a wheel spacer for the rear so that they're even. And on the tires, these are the Wild Peak AT3, and we got a 35, 12.5, 20, and these are an E-load. And then this rubbed a little bit here, so we still got to cut it up. We're gonna have to trim a little here, maybe a small NorCal mod. And then a little bit in the front, but no metal cut right there. There's a good view of the front strut with the reservoir. So this came out really good. It's exactly what the customer wanted. He wanted a nice lift, didn't want to go too aggressive on the offset. So we stayed with the 9.5, negative 18. Still gives a good aggressive look without being too crazy, so it's not too far outside of the fender. If you're interested in this package, click the link in the description below. That'll take you directly to our website, directly to our product page where you can purchase these things individually or as a package. If you're local, we are located at 465 North Oxnard Boulevard in the beautiful city of Oxnard.